Hybrid. We've done streaming before now, but not hybrid, so this is new. Well, good evening. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love the law, love under will.
So welcome to what I am hoping may be the first in a series of lectures on the subject of Liber 15, Ecclesiae Gnosticae Catholiccae Messe, the Mass of the Gnostic Catholic Church, Gnostic Mass, or Liber 15 for short. The purpose, my vision for these lectures really is to foster common understanding about the Gnostic Mass. I'd like to answer questions such as, what the Gnostic Mass is, what type of ritual it is, what its purpose is, especially tonight, what is the conception of spiritual truth that informs this ritual. And then as we go along, how do the different symbols, actions, and words of this ritual bring that purpose and that truth to life? How does the Gnostic Mass provide an opportunity for a congregation to encounter truth? What's the relationship of the Gnostic Mass to thelema more generally? What's the relationship of the Gnostic Mass to spirituality and to just life more generally? What can it teach us? How much of thelema can we teach through the Gnostic Mass? What's the function of a thelemic religious community or church? How might thelema as a religion compare with and contrast with thelema as a personal, magical, mystical, and ethical path in life? The reason for giving this series of lectures is that the Gnostic Mass is the central public and private rite of Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO. It's a common focal point for the members of our community. It's one of the most important common activities that members of OTO engage in, and it is the central activity of our church, Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, or EGC. As such, fostering common understanding of the Gnostic Mass also fosters the bonds of our community. We develop mutual understanding about a common activity. This enriches both our conversations with one another and also with the public as we encounter them. Now, for those in the audience who are not members of our church or members of OTO, there might be parts of this that go over your head if you're not familiar with the ritual, but really the essence of this talk is about the core of thelema as it exists at the heart of the Gnostic Mass, and really how the spiritual essence of thelema relates to the rest of life. And we're going to be using the Gnostic Mass as a symbol set that we're going to look through at these issues. There is no way to cultivate understanding without critical thinking. In order to understand, we have to ask questions. We have to search for answers, and as we find those answers, we have to evaluate them. A community that seeks understanding necessarily values skepticism. It is better inoculated against the capriciousness of authority. Its opinions are more diverse, and it's less tolerant of ignorance and bullshit. Finally, it's my hope that these lectures will help both clergy and congregants have a better understanding of what they're doing and why when they're celebrating this ritual, thereby leading to a greater sense of engagement with the ritual and a sense of personal fulfillment and empowerment in the context of OTO, and maybe even in their lives. Tonight's talk is being organized by Horizon Lodge Ordo Templi Orientis in Seattle, Washington. Horizon is a duly chartered body of Ordo Templi Orientis, established to promote the philosophical and religious system known as thelema. One aspect of our mission is to create a focal point here in Seattle for the experience, for the encounter with thelema. This Gnostic Mass temple that I am standing in right now is a crucial component in the execution of that mission. please consider donating to Horizon so that we can continue to maintain this space and to provide content like this for you throughout the year. There should be a link to donate in the description of this video. For those of you who are watching at home, we will have Q&A at the end of this. So if you think of questions as you go along, you can type them into the chat window and the moderator will select a few at the end. Yes. So while I am delivering this talk tonight on behalf of Horizon, the opinions expressed in this talk are not those necessarily of Horizon or of its members. These are my opinions. I am Entelecheia. I have been a member of OTO for 8 years. I am ordained deacon and clergy. That gives me the authority to celebrate the Gnostic Mass in those roles and also to perform baptisms, confirmations, and marriages under the authority of a supervising bishop. That ordination confers upon me no authority to interpret this ritual. It may come as a surprise if you are a member of another church or if you have some kind of ordination of your own in another tradition to know that one is not required to undergo any kind of formal program of training in EGC, in Thelemic theology or philosophy to become ordained. You don't get that in EGC. At neither of my ordinations was I presented with anything like a comprehensive education in the meaning of the Gnostic Mass or its symbolism. While Crowley says that certain secret formulae of this Mass are taught to the priest in his ordination, no one ever handed me a document that explains the Gnostic Mass in toto. I have never met anyone in or outside of OTO that has that kind of information at their disposal either. As far as I know, Crowley never wrote like a comprehensive, like, this is what this means, etc. In addition to being ordained clergy, I'm also an initiate of the 5th degree of Mysteria Mystica Maxima. That's the initiatory rite of OTO. I was never presented with anything like a comprehensive instruction on the Gnostic Mass in any of those initiation ceremonies either. In other words, I have no authority to interpret this ritual. I have no special information at my disposal which is unavailable to you. So nothing that I say here should be accepted on the basis of my position or rank in this organization. Nor should it be accepted on the basis of my own personal experiences practicing magic, meditating, celebrating the Gnostic Mass. Nothing particular to me as an individual. Since no appeal to authority or secret information is available to me, I have no choice. I have to appeal to your reason. I hope to give you good evidence to support an interpretation of the nature and purpose of the Gnostic Mass. And on the basis of that, to understand how the symbols, actions, and words of the ritual bring that purpose to life. The Gnostic Mass is a religious ceremony authored by Aleister Crowley for the use of OTO. Therefore, the most important evidence we will consider when interpreting the Gnostic Mass is what Aleister Crowley himself said about the ritual, either in public or in private correspondence with other individuals. These will count as direct supports for a claim. There are also indirect supports for claims. For example, the Gnostic Mass is a religious ceremony. So things that Crowley said about religion or religious ceremonies more generally will also count as support for claims in here for an interpretation, even if he's not mentioning the Gnostic Mass by name. So that's what I call an indirect evidence. In addition to being well supported, our interpretation should have implications. An interpretation should help us understand the meaning of many symbols, actions, and words in the Gnostic Mass. It should help clergy better understand what they're doing and why when they are celebrating this ritual. It should help congregants better understand what they're participating in. It should bring us to a deeper understanding of Thelema itself. It should open new worlds. A good interpretation should allow us to go on to do things, to become things that we could not do otherwise. In short, a good interpretation should be empowering. When an idea is well supported but lacks implications, it's trivial. The idea that the Gnostic Mass symbolizes sex is a trivial interpretation. There are enough sexual innuendos in the ritual and in things that Crowley said generally to support the idea that it has something to do with sex, right? But what does it matter? Like, why do we need to see sublimated sex every Sunday? Like, what are we going to get out of that? Sex is obviously incredibly powerful, but what makes it spiritually significant? Is the purpose of life to just have as much mind-blowing sex as possible? The Gnostic Mass doesn't seem like the best way to achieve that goal. Maybe that's just me. What makes sex worthy of a religious celebration? When an interpretation has many implications but very little support, it grants the subjective feeling of having insight into reality while not being grounded in reality. Such a theory is far-fetched. In my opinion, the idea that the Gnostic Mass is a representation, for instance, of Valentinian Gnosticism is far-fetched in this sense. You could regard many aspects of this ritual as aligning with Valentinian cosmology or soteriology. It could be empowering as clergy to believe that you are somehow joining the pleroma when you take communion. You could probably find at least half a dozen ways of aligning this with Valentinian Gnosticism. The problem is that nothing Crowley ever said about the ritual would really support that. There's nothing outside to really ground that. And in fact, you could find quite a few things Crowley said that would make that interpretation problematic. Such an interpretation is fine for personal use, and I'm not saying that people aren't entitled to interpret the ritual the way that they personally find empowering, but if all that we have are just simply personal interpretations of things, how do we ever come to have a common interpretation or a common experience or a common understanding? So what I'm trying to do is trying to find that common ground, something that would justify this ritual being at the center of a church, basically. So there are a lot of quotes in this today from Aleister Crowley. I know that that's tiresome for some people to do that. It's certainly tiresome to read some of them, but you know, the purpose of doing that, well, there's two purposes for it. One is to just simply accustom people to reading Crowley, because you should kind of get over that fear that Crowley's too hard. So, you know, exposure therapy. And also just to keep it anchored, right? To just show that I'm not, you know, it's not just Entelecheia up here, you know, saying whatever. This is grounded in something. So as I use the terms, when an idea is well supported and has implications, it is plausible. When it is very well supported, easily grasped, and highly empowering, it is experienced as profound. My proposal is that we should make all of our interpretations of thelema as profound as possible. But at the very least, they should be plausible. Here's the main claim that I want to make tonight. Stealing my own thunder. The Gnostic Mass is a religious ceremony, the purpose of which is to represent and celebrate truth, held in common by a religious community, or what's called a church. The truth is of two orders, outer and inner. One way to understand this distinction is that outer truth refers to factually true statements we can make about nature, whereas inner truth refers to the nature of the individual soul, what in thelema is called the star. The Gnostic Mass represents and celebrates outer truth by being a ritual of nature worship. Did I miss one? Yeah, I did. Through the Gnostic Mass, we're meant to understand our place in the cosmos. Natural forces are understood and venerated insofar as they support our willed activities. These natural forces are focused into the symbols of the sun and of procreation, and therefore the Gnostic Mass is a ritual of solar phallic worship. But as we will see, outer truth is grounded in, and therefore dependent upon, a more original inner truth. The physical sun that we adore is itself like the reflection in a pool of water of the real sun, which is the sun of our souls. Likewise, the kind of truth we encounter in nature is merely a reflection of an interior mystical truth, which nature has the power to lead us back to. The nature of that truth is love. So that's what I'm doing tonight. If you get lost, this is where we're going. Let's begin by considering how Crowley described the Gnostic Mass and his purpose in writing it. Our most important source for understanding the Gnostic Mass comes from what its author, Aleister Crowley, said about it. And he wrote about it in his autobiography, The Confessions of Aleister Crowley. Now, don't panic. This is the longest quote that I'm going to show you tonight. But this one's really important because this is probably just the clearest statement that he gave about this ritual. He said, during this period, by which he means the year 1913, the full interpretation of the central mystery of Freemasonry became clear in consciousness, and I expressed it in dramatic form in The Ship. The lyrical climax is in some respects my supreme achievement in invocation. In fact, the chorus beginning, "Thou who art I, beyond all I am," seemed to me worthy to be introduced as the anthem into the ritual of the Gnostic Catholic Church, which, later in the year, I prepared for the use of the OTO, the central ceremony of its public and private celebration, corresponding to the Mass of the Roman Catholic Church. Human nature demands, in the case of most people, the satisfaction of the religious instinct. And to very many, this may best be done by ceremonial means. I wished, therefore, to construct a ritual through which people might enter into ecstasy, as they have always done under the influence of appropriate ritual. In recent years, there has been an increasing failure to attain this object. I like how he says in recent years, as though everything was great up until that point. Because the established cults shock their intellectual convictions and outrage their common sense. Thus their minds criticize their enthusiasm. They are unable to consummate the union of their individual souls with the universal soul, as a bridegroom would be to consummate his marriage if his love were constantly reminded that its assumptions were intellectually absurd. It's a really funny thing to imagine. I would love you, but it's too silly. We're going to return to this idea a lot tonight. Consummate the union of their individual souls with the universal soul. That's the goal we have to keep in mind. He goes on to say, I resolved that my ritual should celebrate the sublimity of the operation of universal forces without introducing disputable metaphysical theories. I would neither make nor imply any statement about nature which would not be endorsed by the most materialistic man of science. On the surface, this may sound difficult, but in practice, I found it perfectly simple to combine the most rigidly rational conceptions of phenomena with the most exalted and enthusiastic celebration of their sublimity. Now, from this passage, we can gather the Gnostic Mass is a religious ceremony. It's analogous to the Mass of the Roman Catholic Church. He says it. And he says, the purpose of this ritual is to consummate the union of our individual souls with the universal soul, an experience of which should allow us to enter into ecstasy. By doing this, Crowley sees himself as fulfilling the purpose of religion more generally, a purpose which has been forgotten and repressed over the years by, among other things, superstition. And so in writing the Gnostic Mass, Crowley wanted to avoid anything that might be deemed supernatural. Now, one of the difficulties presented by this statement is that the Gnostic Mass is not an ecstatic ritual. There's no singing or chanting in it. Well, there could be singing, but there's no like dancing or chanting in it, right? It's not the case that when you go to the Gnostic Mass, people are like, writhing on the floor and like speaking in tongues, right? If that happens here, we'll call the fire department. That will happen. While a celebration of Liber 15 should be more edifying than, going to a celebration of the Mass of the Roman Catholic Church, Crowley admits that the rituals aren't really different in kind. Now, one possibility is that Crowley was exaggerating about the potential effects of the Gnostic Mass. I feel like I'm going to start like flopping around and writhing on the floor. It's kind of... Okay. So one possibility is that he was just simply exaggerating about it in the way Crowley sometimes does. Another possibility is that we're doing the ritual improperly. We just haven't found like, the exact right way to make the cross or, whatever drugs need to be necessary to have that happen. But I don't think either of these is true. The case that I'm going to make instead is that the Gnostic Mass is supposed to lead us to an understanding of ourselves and the world, the fruition of which is ecstasy. And if the ritual fails to lead us to ecstasy, it's because we have failed to understand and apply its truth. We have failed to heed the spirit in the letter. Crowley speaks of the potential of religion to bring us to an encounter with truth in Equinox 3. There he says, "The world needs religion. Religion must represent truth and celebrate it. This truth is of two orders. One, concerning nature external to man. Two, concerning nature internal to man. Existing religions, especially Christianity, are based on primitive ignorance of the facts, particularly of external nature. Celebrations must conform to the nature and custom of the people. Christianity has destroyed the joyful celebrations characterized by music, dancing, feasting, and making love, and has kept only the melancholy. The law of Thelema offers a religion which fulfills all necessary conditions." So the purpose of religion generally, and presumably of a Thelemic religious rite such as the Gnostic Mass in particular, is to represent and celebrate what Crowley calls truth. This truth, he says, takes two forms: truth concerning nature external to us and truth concerning nature internal to us. Crowley's criticism of the way in which Christianity has based itself on a superstitious account of external nature reflects his desire, expressed in the quote from Confessions, to celebrate the sublimity of the operation of universal forces without introducing disputable metaphysical theories, and to remain committed to a rational conception of phenomena. The Gnostic Mass fulfills this criteria by being a ritual of nature worship. Thus, prayers are made throughout the course of the ritual, extolling the life-giving virtues of the sun, the moon, the earth, as well as other natural phenomena such as birth, life, and even death. Natural forces are described in the Gnostic Mass in such a way as to relate them back to basic human activities, in particular production and leisure, or what the Gnostic Mass refers to as labor and enjoyment. The light of the sun is adored because it makes labor and enjoyment possible. The Lord is significant as the motive power of our labor and a source of abundant joy. The moon is extolled for the ways in which she makes hunting, loving, toiling, and sailing possible. The lady is significant for the role that she plays in giving and receiving joy. The saints are those who adore the Lord of life and joy. The earth is the site of labor, the womb of all life, who answers the prayers of labor. The principles grant health, wealth, strength, and pleasure, and allow each to accomplish their wills. Labor and enjoyment, or life and joy, together constitute an important binary focus of the Gnostic Mass. What they both have in common is that they are modifications or potentials of our bodies. Building, creating, farming, imagining, love-making, relaxing, dreaming. In short, all willed human activities are impossible without bodies. Notwithstanding the possibility of entities with, that might have astral bodies, without the labor and heroism of incarnation, the will is an abstraction bordering on meaninglessness. It is only in bodies situated on the surface of the earth, with sunlit or star-studded sky above us, all of our joys and failures behind us, and hopes and dreams before us, that we can even speak about having a will. The body is represented in the Gnostic Mass as a two-in-one phenomenon of life and joy. The two-part Eucharist of the Gnostic Mass is also referred to life and joy. The cake of light is the life of man upon earth. It is both the product of labor and that which, by being consumed, fuels a new round of labor. The cup of wine is the vehicle of the joy of man upon earth. It both provides us relief at the end of a day of work and inspires new forms of creativity the following day. It is precisely this life and this joy which were offered up as sacrifices to the sun and which are returned to the priest as the life of the sun and the joy of the earth. The miracle of the Mass is itself a transubstantiation of these two fundamental modes of embodied human being in the world. This transubstantiation or sacrifice is represented as taking place through a process of unification or love. The priest places the particle of the cake of light on the end of the lance, and together he and the priestess depress both into the cup. Together they cry, "Hurliu," a word from the vision and the voice which represents the shrill scream of orgasm, an exemplary mode of human joy. Procreation is the creation of a new life, which is inaugurated by an act culminating in joy or the bliss of orgasm. As simultaneous labor and enjoyment, it is an exemplary mode of the two-in-one nature of the human as an embodied natural being. The act of procreation is the source of our embodiment here on earth. Each of us can trace our respective existences back to a birth. And prior to that, a single orgasm. As such, procreation is a source of ambivalence. On the one hand, we would be unable to do our wills without our bodies. Whatever labor that we engage in, whether it's the ordinary kind you get paid for, whether it's a hobby, or whether it is the exalted labor of the great work, none of it is possible outside of the context of embodiment. Magic is ineluctably linked to the body, right? Directionality, north, south, east, west, right hand, left hand, colors, all the stuff. On the other hand, the body is the source of all of our limitations. Because we're embodied, that's why we're vulnerable. Even our minds are dependent upon our bodies. We're susceptible to hurt feelings, wounded pride, betrayal. Our physical bodies are susceptible to illness and infirmity. To be born is immediately to incur the penalty of death. Womb and tomb are combined in the symbol of Babylon in the Gnostic Mass. Thus, all the spiritual significance and ambiguity of our embodiment is condensed into the symbol of procreation. Procreation has further spiritual significance insofar as it presents us with a way in which, even as mortal beings, we can participate in a kind of immortality. While the individual may suffer death, the human race continues through procreation. Insofar as one reproduces and cares for and raises offspring, they can participate in this higher purpose. Thus, both birth and continuing knowledge from generation unto generation are extolled in the collects of the Gnostic Mass. Following the usage of Richard Payne Knight and Hargrave Jennings, Crowley refers to the generative principle as the phallus. The phallus is not the male organ per se. Rather, it is the generative principle more generally. The collapse of labor and joy into a single act, the orgasmic union of male and female. The phallus is represented in the Gnostic Mass by the lance, but its perfection is the union with the Grail, culminating in the shrill cry of orgasm. Summarizing this process, the priest says, "Tuto este to sperma mu, ho pater est no huios diatop pneumahagion." This is my seed. The Father is the Son through the Holy Spirit. On a naturalistic reading, the particle of the cake of light represents the priest's spermatozoon. It is the lion's serpent that destroys the destroyer, or which vanquishes death. The priest realizes immortality. He lives in the sun. This naturalistic portrayal of immortality is what Crowley refers to as the lesser mystery of the sword and the disc. It pertains to one layer of meaning of the Gnostic Mass. Crowley summarizes many of these points in the new comment on L322. There are to be no regular temples of Nuith and Hadith, for they are incommensurables and absolutes. Our religion, therefore, for the people is the cult of the sun, who is our particular star in the body of Nuit, from whom, in the strictest sense, come this earth, a chilled spark of him, and all our light and life. His vice-regent and representative in the animal kingdom is his cognate symbol, the phallus, representing love and liberty. Rahor Kuit. Like all true gods, is therefore a solar phallic deity. But we regard him as he is in truth, eternal. The solar phallic deities of the old aeon, such as Osiris, Christ, Hiram, Adonis, Hercules, etc., were supposed, through our ignorance of the cosmos, to die and rise again. Thus we celebrated rites of crucifixion and so on, which have now become meaningless. So in the creed of the Gnostic Mass, we say, "I believe in one star in the company of stars, and one Father of life, chaos, the sole vice-regent of the sun upon the earth." When you say that, Crowley intended you to profess belief in these two principles that we've been talking about, the sun and the generative principle, or the phallus. The sun is the principle of light and life in the macrocosm. The phallus is the principle of love and liberty on the earth or in the microcosm. Together, they form Rahor Kuit, the Lord of the Aeon. So even though Rahor Kuit is never mentioned by name in Liber 15, as the solar phallus, he is the primary object of adoration in the ritual. Ancient religions' notions of immortality and salvation were based, at least in Crowley's view, upon the observation that God, the sun, died and was reborn again daily and over the course of the equinoxes and solstices. The Copernican revolution in astronomy established that the Earth, in fact, moves around the sun, not vice versa. The sun is not dependent upon our sacrifices for its immortality. Rather, the Earth depends for its existence on the sun, as it is but a frozen spark of that star. Likewise, the finite individual is not the essence. The species is. We are merely vehicles for the propagation of genes. To acknowledge the priority of the species relative to the individual is akin or analogous to acknowledging the priority of the sun relative to the earth. In making embodied human activity and enjoyment, along with all those conditions that make them possible, a focus of a religious ceremony, Crowley has fulfilled his promise to remain committed to a rational conception of phenomena. He might be using poetic language to describe these conditions, but the picture presented in the ritual is broadly naturalistic and anchored in pragmatic human activities like labor and leisure. Even the view of immortality offered is merely figurative. As natural individuals, we are not immortal, we die. But it's through our awareness of this connection to this larger, impersonal process which makes our temporary lives meaningful. And all that we have to sacrifice to enjoy that is just the illusion of separation from nature. Thus, the individual is represented as connected with a higher power which sustains their life's most important activities. In his new comment on 348-49, Crowley describes this hierarchical relationship. He says, each man's child consciousness is a star in the cosmos of the sun, as the sun is a star in the cosmos of New Eve. Right? So there's an analogy there. It's this interconnectedness with something larger, something beyond ourselves, which we are representing and we're engaged in this celebration of in the Gnostic Mass. If you wanted to create an updated version of the Gnostic Mass, a ritual celebration that took into account scientific discoveries since 1913, we might add discoveries in the field of cosmology, of certain facts that we know are indispensable for life. For example, astronomer Martin Rees has argued that 6 numbers underlie the fundamental physical properties of the universe, and each is the precise value needed to permit life to flourish. Why are we here? As Rees puts it, these 6 numbers constitute a recipe for the universe. He adds that if any one of the numbers were different, even to the tiniest degree, there would be no stars, no complex elements, no life. In addition to celebrating sexual reproduction, we might add into our modern religious celebration acknowledgement of basic facts of chemistry that make DNA replication or the Krebs cycle possible. But is this really what we're after in a religious ceremony? Clearly it's part of it, but it's not the full picture. By restricting the object of adoration to those conditions which make human activity and rest possible, Crowley has satisfied the requirement that the presuppositions of the ritual remain committed to a rational account of phenomena, as he says. No disputable metaphysical beliefs have been introduced so far. This satisfies the instinct of reason, but does it satisfy the religious instinct? The instinct of reason is to search for rational explanations for phenomena. The reason it rains is because water vapor in the air condenses. The reason there is water vapor in the air is that it evaporated from the sea. It evaporates from the sea because photons from the sun strike the ocean and transfer energy into it. Photons come out of the sun because of the fusion of protons in the core of the sun. That happens because of conditions that held at the moment of the Big Bang, or whatever the origin of the universe was. Presumably, that rests upon conditions in the multiverse, or whatever. And it goes on, maybe forever, or maybe you think there is a supernatural cause of the universe that snapped its fingers, right? That's the instinct of reason. Well, why did that happen? Why did that happen, right? Sort of like a kid. The problem is that for any why-type question you ask, the answer, it has to fall into one of 3 categories. It has to be a brute assertion of fact that itself lacks justification, or it can be a reason which itself is in need of a further justification, or it's an answer that assumes what it hopes to ground, right? So if everything was set in motion by God snapping his fingers just because he felt like it, that's just a brute fact. That means that everything is pretty much just senseless, right? God just maybe stumbled out of his bed one day, and that's why we're here. If there is some prior reason for it, oh, well, God snapped his fingers because it was in the divine wisdom to do that. Well, why was it in the divine wisdom? Well, because of God's perfection. Like, you just keep going back through reasons. And so, again, the bottom is kind of falling out because, like, where do the reasons end? Or you have some version of God snapped his fingers because he snapped his fingers, in which case you're moving in a circle, right? For this reason, Crowley says that the image that we tend to form of the universe through reason is inherently unsatisfying. In fact, he says that it becomes painful, it becomes sickening to look at it this way. That's the theoretical use of reason, asking those why questions. But there's also a practical use of reason. Practical reason is largely what's at play in the symbolism of the Mass that we've been discussing so far. So, Gnostic Mass doesn't represent the universe through the lens of why questions. It's not trying to figure out why is there something rather than nothing. It's anchored in portraying conditions that make our wills effective, essentially. Nature is here supporting us. We don't know why anything exists. All we know is that nature exists, we exist. It's a good pairing, it works happily ever after. It's common for many Thelemites, at least that I've spoken to understand Thelema by means of this kind of pragmatic means-ends framing. So according to this view, there is no univocal meaning to life. Each person has their own end, and that end is irreducibly subjective, individual, and even private. We can't say what's ultimately good in life. All we can speak on is whether certain actions will successfully attain certain ends. Morality and ultimately spirituality are reduced down to technical problems. The problem with this framing is that it's an interpretation of Thelema purely from the perspective of practical reasoning. It may not be the perspective of the universe through theoretical reasoning, but it's still a view of the world framed exclusively in terms of our powers to direct and indirectly control things, which is still a component of what Crowley calls the Ruach, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. This isn't bound to satisfy the religious instinct, because religious experiences, or what we tend now to term mystical experiences, are ones in which we lose control. These aren't experiences in which everything that exists is relativized to the intellect or to the will, the personal will. These are experiences in which the exact opposite occurs. We are decentered. Our normal conceptions of self and world are just radically disrupted and overthrown. This is accompanied by awe, wonder, sometimes even terror. These are not experiences in which we assimilate the world to our needs. Rather, the opposite occurs. An insight occurs which demands we somehow accommodate ourselves to it, although it's completely unclear how that's supposed to happen. We have the closely related problem of trying to make sense of Crowley's claim that a religious ceremony in general, and presumably the Gnostic Mass in particular, ought to consummate the union of our individual souls with the universal soul and enable us to enter into ecstasy. In order to have a rational understanding of something, I have to separate and stand apart from it. First of all, I have to separate from the thing, right? Because I have to observe it and measure it and calculate with it. I also have to stand one step removed from myself because I have to make sure that my biases aren't getting in the way of what I'm thinking about the thing in order to be accurate. We get into a similarly detached calculating stance when we take a purely pragmatic view on life, because we're thinking about how to achieve an end, what are the means I have to apply to it, right? What's going to work, what's more likely to fail. And yet, the religious instinct isn't for detachment. On the contrary, it's for deep mutual participation and involvement and being caught up. It's ecstasy. Religion must represent and celebrate the truth of nature external to the individual. Part of that requires us to represent nature in a way which avoids superstition. In this case, truth, as we're talking about it, can be understood as a property of our thoughts or our statements about the world. The quality being true is then to be understood as the opposite of being false, right? So we're thinking about truth in terms of a binary opposites, true versus false. How do you tell if a proposition about the world is true? You go and check, right? Is it raining outside? We go outside and we look, and it's done. It seems very simple. But Crowley observed a problem with this notion of truth, and he wrote about it in the aptly named Little Essays Toward Truth. What is truth? It is absurd to attempt to define it. For when we say that S is P, rather than S is Q or S is R, we assume that we already know the meaning of truth. This is really why all the discussions as to whether truth depends on external correspondence, internal coherence, or whatnot, neither produce conviction nor withstand analysis. Now, I have to warn you, this is probably the most subtle and difficult part of this. So if you can make it through this, you can make it through anything. I'm going to try to break down what I think Crowley is onto here, because I think he's got a valid point. What Crowley describes as definitions of the type S is P is what we're calling propositions. Propositional knowing is the ability to make statements of fact or to make valid inferences from those facts to other conclusions. For example, we may listen to what we hear outside and infer from what we hear that it is raining. How do we know it's raining? We go outside and we check. Crowley's point here is that what makes a statement like it is raining true is not as self-evident as you may think. Let's assume truth is the correspondence of some proposition P with some state of affairs in the world S. But such a statement is itself a proposition. We can put quotes around it, and now it's a proposition. So now you can ask the question of this: what is the state of affairs in the world that it has to correspond to? Well, it has to correspond to what truth really is, obviously. You see, we've gone in a circle. That's what Crowley calls the correspondence theory of truth. That's what he's referring to. The internal coherence theory says that truth has nothing to do with states of affair. Rather, truth is the proper logical relations between propositions. One could raise multiple problems with this. Crowley's very vague about this, but this is what I think he has in mind. Something like a coherence theory of truth would apply nicely to something like this, where the statements are true definitionally. So we know a bachelor is just an unmarried man. John's a bachelor, therefore John is an unmarried man. You don't have to actually refer to anything in the world to know that this is true. But then, what about statements about the age of the earth, or, whether it's really raining outside? You're not going to be able to, it's unclear how you would decide definitionally that the earth is, whatever, 4.6 billion years old. How would our minds ever be challenged by the world if truth is merely internal coherence, if we're only ever dealing with our minds? For that matter, how would you explain mystical experience, which appears to be an encounter with something, with some kind of truth that actually shatters our coherence? That's my best attempt at reconstructing what Crowley means. I think that's what he has in mind when he says that our attempts to understand truth at the level of propositions don't produce conviction or withstand analysis. He's not saying that there's no such thing as truth. And he does not mean that it makes no difference what we say or think about things. As just one small piece of proof, he says, "We must not suppose for an instant that the book of the law is opposed to reason. It makes reason the autocrat of the mind. The mind should be a perfect machine, an apparatus for representing the universe accurately and impartially to its master." I think what he's saying is that statements can be true or false. Truth and falsity are properties that do belong to them. Truth doesn't originate with them, though. The source of truth is something non-propositional. Our most basic way of connecting and being in the world is not by means of our thoughts or our propositions or our beliefs about it. There's something more fundamental to that, which is undergirding it. His word for what that source is, he calls it neshama. He says, briefly, truth is an idea of a super-rational order pertaining to neshama, not to ruach. That all rational conceptions imply that we know truth, and that truth is in their propositions, only shows that these so-called rational ideas are not really rational at all. Now, I've done my damnedest to avoid Kabbalah up until now, so please, I'm going to try to get us through this. It tends to, it can obscure more than it reveals, obviously. The terms neshama and ruach are terms from Hebrew Kabbalah. They refer to parts of the soul. What Crowley calls ruach, that's just what we have been calling propositional knowing up until now. Ruach is more than that, but propositional knowing belongs to ruach. He contrasts ruach with neshama, which he equates with the self of the individual. He says, now the same truth, which is light, which is implicit in each spark of the intelligible, what is it but the self of every man? It is this that informs his every motion, this that lies closest to his heart and soul, being indeed their mainspring and their dial, the principle of section and of measure. Now pay attention. By self, Crowley does not mean the personality of the individual. Personality, memory, desire, power of choice, all of those belong to what Crowley calls ruach. By contrast, the self, or the neshama, is the true self of the individual that transcends what we normally take ourselves to be. It is addressed in the Gnostic Mass's anthem as, "Thou who art I beyond all I am, who hast no nature and no name." It is only encountered through the process Crowley calls initiation. He says, now initiation is by etymology the journeying inwards. It is the voyage of discovery, O wonder world of one's own soul. And this is truth that stands upon the prow, eternally alert. This is truth that sits with one strong hand, gripping the helm. The truth of external nature, what we're calling propositional truth, which we can contrast with falsehood or superstition, that kind of truth has its basis in what he's calling inner truth. The claim here is not that external truth is relative to our needs or to our emotions or what people sometimes call, my will. If you walk off a cliff, you will probably fall and die. You don't have to look down first. The Thalamic universe is not Looney Tunes, right? Doing your will is not Wile E. Coyote. The claim is that our ability to make true or false statements about the world rests upon a condition external to reason. Therefore, this is important, we can't introspect upon it. You can't control or manipulate it. Why? Because all acts of introspection or control are assuming this underlying condition. Crowley calls this condition self, soul, or neshama. He also refers to it as the silent self or the sun of the soul, which is the internal counterpart of the sun of the cosmos. He will choose the object of his passion at the nod of his silent self. He will not allow the prejudice either of sense, emotion, or rational judgment to obscure the sun of his soul. We're almost there. We've been looking at the essence of religious truth generally and of the Gnostic Mass in particular. This winding path has led us to one of the foundational ideas of Thelema, the idea that every man and every woman is a star. Crowley explains the concept of the star and its relationship to the Thelemic view of the universe in his 1938 introduction to the Book of the Law. He says, this book, meaning the Book of the Law, explains the universe. The elements are nuit, space, that is, the total of possibilities of every kind, and hadit, any point which has experience of these possibilities. This idea is for literary convenience symbolized by the Egyptian goddess Nuit, a woman bending over like the arch of the night sky. Hadit is symbolized as a winged globe at the heart of Nuit. Every event is a uniting of some one monad with one of the experiences possible to it. Every man and every woman is a star, that is, an aggregate of such experiences, constantly changing with each fresh event, which affects him or her either consciously or subconsciously. The world described by the Book of the Law is composed of two elements. There's space, right, and all the matter occupying it, what we've been calling external nature, or what Crowley refers to here as the sum total of all possibilities. And any point, as he calls it, that has experience of nature by realizing one of the possibilities in it. These two principles are symbolized in the book by two deities that appear on the funerary stele of Ankh-Afnakansu, a priest of the Egyptian god Mentu who lived in Thebes around 725 BCE. The first is symbolized by the Egyptian sky goddess Nuit, and the second by the winged solar disk Hadit. The star is defined as the union of Nuit and Hadit. Hadit is the core of every star. He is thus the impersonal identity within the individuality of every man and every woman. Right? Remember what I said, this is not your personality that he's talking about. Hadit seems to be the principle of motion, which is everywhere, yet is not extended in any dimension, except as it chances to combine with the matter which is Nuit. There can evidently be no manifestation apart from this conjunction. A cobs or star is apparently any nucleus where this conjunction has taken place. Cobs is just the Egyptian word for star. Furthermore, Hadit represents the immortal essence of each individual and is distinct from the personality, or who we normally take ourselves to be. It follows that as Hadit can never be known, there is no death. The death of the individual is his awakening to the impersonal immortality of Hadit. This applies less to physical death than to the crossing of the abyss. One may attain to be aware that one is but a particular child of the play of Hadit and Nuit. One's personality is then perceived as being a disguise. Again, we see the idea that the core or the essence of the self transcends the personality. Here we are being also introduced to the idea of the personality being an outward display or disguise, essentially a tool of expression of Hadit, which is otherwise distinct from everything we take ourselves to be. Again, we come to know all of that by means of initiation, what Crowley is here referring to as crossing the abyss. Every event, that is, every change from one state to the next, is the result of Hadit uniting with Nuit. As Crowley puts it in the new comment, the theogony of our law is entirely scientific. Nuit is matter, Hadit is motion in their full physical sense. This is a continual, ongoing process. A star is the course taken by a particular Hadit on its path through Nuit. The aggregate or sum total of all of these events, perhaps across innumerable incarnations, makes up the essence of an individual. Crowley's term for the unification of Hadit with Nuit that occurs moment to moment is love. He says, in order to have motion, one must have change. In fact, one must have this in order to have anything at all. Now, this change is what we call love. Thus, love under will is the law of motion. We may say briefly that Hadit is motion, that is change or love. The symbol of Godhead in Egypt was the Ankh, which is a sandal strap, implying the power to go, and it suggests the rosy cross, the fulfillment of love by its shape. The ground of what we were calling truth of nature was found to be inner truth. Inner truth is itself grounded in the essence of the individual, which is the soul, the self, the neshama, or the star. But the star is nothing other than the continual, ongoing coitus between Hadit, the impersonal drive of the individual to become, and nature, or Nuit. Therefore, the ground and essence of truth is love. There is an ongoing, continual, dynamic coupling taking place all the time between the impersonal depths of ourselves and the environment or nature that we find ourselves to be in. We are constantly being pushed out into the world. Even when we are as still as we can possibly be, there is still the experience of one moment passing to the next, to the next, to the next. That is the sign of the coitus of Hadit within and Nuit without. Hadit is the impersonal core of the individual. His union with Nuit is taking place below the level of conscious awareness. We cannot introspect upon this process because every act of introspection is pushed by that process. It's the result of it. As Crowley says, Hadit is hidden in Nuit and knows her, she being an object of knowledge. But he is not knowable, for he is merely that part of her which she formulates in order that she may be known. Anything known is Nuit, not Hadit. This applies to knowledge of mental events with the same force that it applies to knowledge of external events. Any experience whatsoever, be it of nature or of mental events, is the end result of a union of Hadit with Nuit. Right? The world we find ourselves in, full of people, furniture, customs, days of the week, meetings, wars, political and religious customs, and so forth. All of that is the result of this ongoing dynamic coupling between the unknowable interior depths of ourselves and the unknowable depths of nature. Because that world is out there for us, yes, we can make true and false statements about it. We can also learn how to cope with it, right? I can, engage with the world through my body. I can fit myself to it practically in various ways. Theoretical and practical reasoning both rest upon that fittedness, which is an ongoing fitting and pulling apart and refitting again and again between the depths of ourselves and the depths of nature. But because that process of fittedness is what's driving our reason, we can't reflect on it rationally. We can't get to the basis of it that way. We're always going to be like one step behind it, only ever in a position to appreciate the downstream effects of it. As Crowley said, truth is an idea of a supra-rational order pertaining to neshama, not to ruach. The deepest part of yourself, thou who art I, beyond all I am, who hast no nature and no name, strives to have contact with and to know the deepest part of reality. We can infer this from many different experiences in life. For example, think about what it's like when you are in the zone, when you're in what's called a flow state. That would be like when you're engaged in a really engrossing activity, maybe one where the challenge presented by the activity is just one step beyond your current skill set, right? So you have to put everything into it. Your sense of self changes in relationship to the task, right? The sense of separateness goes away. Self-image management fades into the background, right? Because you're being fitted more and more and more and more. You're being pushed into the reality, molded to fit it. As Crowley says, knowledge is the loss of the knower in the known. This is an intrinsically satisfying, universal, cross-cultural experience. This belongs to human beings. Think about the experience of appreciating natural beauty, right? When you're appreciating natural beauty, isn't it a bit like the world was created by a mind like yours for a mind like yours? Feels like there's a mutual depth there touching each other. Think about how you can get absorbed into a really compelling novel or film. If you're an artist, a musician, a writer, somebody who creates, think about the deep connection you feel when you are in your deepest moments of creativity, working with an artistic medium. Think about what it's like to fall in love. You're revealing depths of yourself to another person while they are doing the same thing to you. Falling in love is mutual accelerating disclosure. That's why it feels like falling. It's just picking up speed. If the essence of truth is love, and if a proper religious ceremony is supposed to represent and celebrate truth, doesn't it make sense that a good religious ritual should depict a love story? The Gnostic Mass depicts the relationship between an individual and what is most real as a love relationship. It's a story of mutual accelerating opening and disclosure. The priestess pulls down the veil over the tomb. She reveals the priest to the congregation and to the temple. At the same time, isn't she also opening up his world to something much wider? His contact with her in the ceremony of the introit is not some kind of detached, practical affair. He's not just coming away with, like, a couple new facts. Oh, well, I didn't know that before. That's interesting. Oh, wow, I can do an LBRP now, right? I mean, he's coming away from it a changed man. He starts out as a man among men, and at the end of it, he's an adept. He's a lover. Shortly thereafter, he's going to do the same thing for her, right? Parts the veil. He's disclosing her now in a more exalted, much more powerful, and also far, far, far more vulnerable fashion, right? Going much further down into the depths. What happens at the climax of the ritual? Or I should say, what happens right before the climax of the ritual? Symbolically, he opens himself up. He reaches inside of himself. He turns himself inside out. The fullest experience of truth is one of total participation, total surrender, total abandonment. This is the complete loss of the knower in the known. And if we're to believe what the ritual says, it turns him into God. What's happening from the point of view of the congregation? Well, they're also participating in the ritual as well. I mean, they're getting up and, they're doing things and saying words and singing and saying their parts. And at the conclusion of the ritual, they're going up and they're taking the sacrament, which is it's a visceral form of participation, right? You're taking, taking it into your body, you're participating it to you, you're changing its shape, changing you. But what about after? So they go on to their lives after, and maybe if they were paying really close attention to the ritual, maybe throughout the course of the week, they start to notice some of the subtle ways in which their own engagement with reality is a little bit like an ongoing, right, love story of reciprocal disclosure. They might notice the subtle ways in which the self has to change in order to know the known, right? Even just in terms of our physical engagement with reality, right? You have to get into the right position to grab something or to pick something up. There's a certain kind of ongoing fittedness, right? That's always going on. There's always a process of mutual disclosure and opening. Next week, when they attend the ritual again, maybe they start to pick up on more subtle nuances of what's going on in the ritual. They're not just looking at it at the surface anymore. Their minds are going down deeper into it. They're noticing more. They're seeing more into reality through it. Outside of the ritual, now maybe they're seeing even more deeply into this constant dynamic give and take that's always going on with the world. When they go back to the ritual again, now they're seeing even more deeply, picking up on more nuances of the symbolism, falling more deeply into the ritual. This is how the Gnostic Mass could succeed in consummating the union of our individual souls with the universal soul. It can lead to a series of cascading insights, the culmination of which would be religious ecstasy. A mystical experience is when that process of fittedness and cascading insights just gets out of control, and it goes all the way. Not all religious or mystical insights have to occur while you're meditating or doing magic. If I had to take a guess, I would say the majority of them don't. I actually don't know of many. Most of the stories I hear are people doing normal things. My own religious experience happened while I was standing in my kitchen, like opening a bottle of beer. You should be really careful what you're doing, because it could just happen like that, and then you'll have to stand up here someday and tell a story like that. Spiritual practices, spiritual traditions don't make these things happen. They can make them more likely to happen, for sure, but you can't just pull a lever and get it to happen. It doesn't work that way. To say that the Gnostic Mass represents and celebrates truth is not to say that it gives us all the correct ideas about the world. It's not a newspaper article. It's not a study on the effects of trans fats. It's, if you wrote a ritual like this in the year 2000, it wouldn't be correct now, right? To say nothing of one written in 1913. That's not the strength of the ritual. Nor does the value of the Gnostic Mass, in my opinion, consist in some supernatural effect attendant upon saying all the words and doing all the actions in the exact correct order, exactly as written, according with custom in 1913, now, or at any other time. That's because the Gnostic Mass is not a tool to achieve an end. Whether that end be to attract members, to fulfill the lodge's quota, to make the Electoral College happy, to achieve our individual heart's desires. Its value can't be reduced to a simple technique. That's because truth is not a technique. To say that the Gnostic Mass represents and celebrates truth means that it's a means of insight into the nature of truth itself. It's an object of contemplation. That truth is not a set of facts, natural or supernatural, but rather a dynamic process of reciprocal disclosure between the depths of ourselves and the depths of nature that has many of the qualities of a love relationship. We see a relationship with what is real portrayed through the ritual's drama. And that affords us the ability to see real patterns in the world outside the ritual. That in turn could allow us to see more deeply into the ritual and then back into the world, and so on and so forth. We do not have the ability to introspect upon our own depths. Hadith is out of reach for us. Nor do we have the ability to comprehend the infinite vastness of nature. The world is a marvel beyond imagination, before whom time is ashamed, the mind bewildered, and the understanding dark. That being said, we are able to engage with the attunement between the depths of nature and our own beings indirectly when we engage with it through the image of love. Tonight we considered the purpose of the Gnostic Mass. We saw that it's a religious ceremony, analogous to the Mass of the Roman Catholic Church, the purpose of which is to satisfy the religious instinct. Crowley defined this as consummating the union of the individual soul with the universal soul, thereby bringing about ecstasy. We saw that the purpose of a religious rite in general, and of the Gnostic Mass in particular, must be to represent and celebrate external and internal truth. External truth is symbolized by the sun, internal truth by the star or the sun of the soul. We came to understand these truths by means of various analogies. As the earth is to the sun, so are we to nature in general and our species. We're part of a larger interconnected web of life, without which we would not be able to accomplish our wills. This is because we are dependent upon our physical bodies, which are represented in the Gnostic Mass as a two-in-one phenomenon of labor and enjoyment. Labor and enjoyment become one in us in the act of procreation, through which we can participate in a kind of immortality. The continuity of the species is like a reflection on the earth of the immortality of the sun in the heavens. Truths of external nature are represented in the Gnostic Mass as something to be grateful for, to be celebrated. They are also represented in the ritual in order to serve as a check against superstition and absurdity. This accords with Crowley's desire to stick as closely as possible to a rational conception of phenomena. But there's a third function of the representation of truths of external nature. Truths of external nature can lead us back by analogy to truths of internal nature. As the earth is to the sun, so are we to our souls. The sun is the center of the solar system, not the earth. Likewise, the personality is not the center of the individual, the soul or the star is. As embodied individuals, we are dependent upon the interconnected web of life to support us in our going. We must serve nature in order to serve ourselves. Likewise, our individual personalities and bodies are mere means for our souls to experience the universe, themselves and other individuals. In both instances, we are invited to step into larger contexts and understand ourselves and find meaning in relationship to them. Furthermore, just as the union of male and female in the act of procreation allows us to participate in the immortality of the species, so does the union of male and female in us, or the union of opposites more generally, lead the way toward understanding God within each of us. This is because the immortal God within us is the constant ecstatic union of opposites. So in addition to representing biological reproduction, the Gnostic Mass is also representing the internal truth of each individual. But we saw that external truth is in fact dependent upon internal truth, which means that the normal hierarchical way we tend to think about things has to be reversed. We can understand the inner on analogy with the outer, and in fact, we have to. We cannot reflect directly on the inner processes that allow perception and reflection to take place. We can only symbolize them. And as we'll see next time, that's the main function of a living religious tradition, as opposed to a dead ceremony. But upon reaching inner truth, by means of initiation, we discover that the inner has primacy, and the outer is merely a reflection. In other words, we see our bodies, our sexuality, and nature more generally as the expressions of an inner living spirit, the nature of which is love and annihilation. O lion and O serpent that destroy the destroyer, be mighty among us. We've just scratched the surface of this ritual. But understanding what the ritual has to accomplish and why is key to understanding the rest of its symbolism. An interpretive framework beginning from the truth of the Gnostic Mass helps orient the rest of our interpretation. And it helps orient ritual celebrants toward the ritual in such a way as to ensure continual and tight contact or fittedness between its inner depth and its external manifestation, thereby vivifying the external letter with the living spirit of truth. I would like to thank Horizon Lodge for hosting this talk this evening. Again, for those of you listening to the public version of this lecture, there is a donation link in the description. Every dollar keeps us going during these very hard times, so whatever you can spare. I would also like to thank my sound man and technology guy, Scott, this evening. He's waving. He has been generous enough to lend his equipment and his knowledge this evening so that we can live stream this talk to our members and subscribers at home. If you'd like out to the lobby, we'll bring out a little bit of wine too, if you'd like that. The law of liberty being ours, may your minds be open unto the light. May your hearts be centers of love. May your bodies be temples of life. Love is the law. Love under will. Thank you. So I'd be happy to answer any questions we have from either the room or from our at-home audience. Or maybe you need wine first. I don't know. I might need wine to answer them. Yeah, go ahead.
Will this be linked on the website?
The question is, will this be linked on the website? Yes.
Good.
Yeah. This will be on our YouTube channel, and there's a link. There's a link to the YouTube channel on the website, so you can look at all.
About 10 times.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, there's a lot. We worked through a lot of material.
Oh, yeah.
It's a lot of. It was a kind of a long, meandering path, but it was the fastest way up the mountain I could go. Yeah. The goal was to get to the center of the thing as quickly as possible. So, any other questions? Did we get any from the?
No, just Ken Brooks says thank you very much.
Ken Brooks says thank you very much. Thank you, Ken, for attending. Thank you very much. Well, that's fantastic. So why don't we go and relax a little bit and have some wine and give you a chance? Yeah, go ahead.
So are you planning another talk?
So if there's, do you want another talk? We can keep going. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There are there's a lot more to talk about. Like I said, we just scratched the surface of this. We talked about truth as love. We touched upon truth as light. And there's also truth as life, the difference between the living and the dead spirit. And how do you keep, like, what causes a tradition to go dead? What keeps it alive? What keeps it alive is keeping it connected with this core, this dynamic core, right? Which is a constantly changing truth, right? So discussing the nature of symbols in general, and why are so many of the symbols in Thelema monstrous, would be a really good thing to begin to talk about. Why is Baphomet this sort of monstrous creature at the center of this? Why the beast in Babylon? Why a destroyer invoked at the heart of this? Why do we need to invoke such a destructive power to get out of this prison that we find ourselves in? How do we do that? How do we harness that power? And of course, talking through all the different symbols of the ritual. What does Babylon exactly symbolize in this? What is Baphomet? What is the Holy Spirit? There's a lot to talk about. But I think this is the key. What I gave you tonight, you can go pretty far with this. So yeah, we can do more of these. That would be fun. They're fun to write and think about. And I always find that over the long term, there are interesting comments and questions about them too. So I know sitting in a lecture like this is a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. So you do need a little bit of a breather. I understand.
I think the only thoughts I had with this is, it's obviously as the world's changed, this ritual had to change. I would imagine, and if so, how and why, and I mean, it's. I can see where it can be. It needs to stay the same, but I can also see where it definitely needs to change with how we're changing, because that's the nature of being human. So I would be interested in understanding the Mass from that perspective, and that how important it is to change as we're changing. I'm not probably explaining that well,
I
but
understand.
just because, I mean, in the time that I've been coming here now, I've seen a huge amount of change in myself, and I understand a lot more about what's going on in this whole thing because of the Mass, but also because how my interpretation keeps changing every time I participate in it, whether I'm childing or I'm just sitting here going through it. And I find that fascinating because I sure as hell didn't experience that in the Catholic Mass. So there's something there, and I would like to know more about that.
So for those that who are listening to this who didn't hear the comment, if I can paraphrase what you're saying to the extent of change with regard to the Gnostic Mass. There's changing times. To what extent does the ritual remain relevant or have to change? And you're also very much struck by how much you change in coming to this ritual, and that you're noticing different things about it each time and feeling yourself changing in relationship to it, which is good, because that means that some of what I was saying tonight was probably like a little bit correct about that. So that's actually a little bit of a relief. So yeah, I think that so what I have tried to do. So there is some controversy around the Gnostic Mass, and with people in or out of the OTO saying that that its message is outdated, or that it doesn't apply. And what I kind of wanted to do with this was to show just how much of it actually sort of does make sense and still does apply. And maybe try to shift the perspective on the ritual a little bit, to try to put those things at the center, not for the purposes of ignoring, right, the parts of it that might seem outdated. That's not really the point of it, but rather to orient us toward what is essential in the ritual, so that if somewhere down the line it were necessary to, say, update the ritual or even create another one that accomplished something similar, right? You can't do that unless you know what's essential and what's inessential. I think that it's sort of common in the church now to think that, well, you know, you do everything exactly as it's written and then, you know, ... profit, right? And I'm trying to demystify that a little bit and say like, well, you know, it's not that, you know, something magical happens when you put all of these pieces in the exact right place. There's a dynamic that's going on in it. And that's, if you pick up on that, right, that's really sort of what the essence is. But, you know, the parts of it that are supposed to accurately reflect things in the world, it serves a few purposes. It's actually complex. It's a little bit, you can go pretty deep into it, but yeah, I think those are good observations, and those are things that we're very interested in the church. There's been some dialogue about it, and but hopefully this contributes something, you know, throws something into the pot in terms of helping those discussions. Anybody have any other comments or questions?
So 2 comments in the chat.
Oh, okay, sure.
There's Kelly Lanigan says thank you, and Richard Davis started to ask a question, but I'm not really. It says typical me question. The EGC manifesto authorized in 1944 says, and that's the end of. I'm not sure if Richard meant to put more.
So there was one thank you and a question that kind of trailed off, it sounds like.
It says the masters have decided that the time has come for the administration of the sacraments of the Aeon of Horus to those capable of comprehension.
Yeah, that's the EGC manifesto. Yeah. So yeah, that's what we were touching on that tonight. That's the sacrament of basically the unification of opposites, essentially, through the act of love, right? The sacrament's happening at different levels. It's happening between the priest and the priestess. It's happening between the congregation and the ritual. It's happening between the elements. It's all over the place. It's happening in the world when you get up and go outside and look. It's happening right this moment, right? That's kind of what it's supposed to have, this fractal effect, I think. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your indulgence and your patience and listening. And thank you at home for listening, and the comments. They're very much appreciated. And yeah, hopefully we'll be doing another one of these in a month or two. So stay tuned to that. And with that, love is the law, love under will. Thank you. Have a good night.